If you could only preach Christmas or Easter, which would you choose to preach?
Easter.
Wow, you had that one loaded up in the chamber pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, they're both fun to preach, but Easter's so much more fun. I feel like, the Christmas story and Christmas in general, there's just so much tradition that you're fighting through. It feels like you have no one's attention. Easter is a little bit the same way, but it's like Jesus rose. I mean, this whole thing doesn't matter if Jesus didn't rise. And it's a lot of fun. So I'd say Easter.
All right, Easter it is. Well, we're going to talk about Christmas and Easter. Are you okay talking about Christmas?
Oh, totally. I love Christmas.
All right, let's get into it. Hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. This is sponsored by Ministry Pass, ministrypass.com. Y'all go check it out. I actually have, in an upcoming episode, I've got some stats that Ministry Pass put together for us.
Oh, fun.
Yeah,
that'll be cool to hear.
We'll do that in, I think, the next episode. But today, what we're talking about is, my name's Dave Schrein. You're still Luke Simmons.
Hey there.
Hey, and this is the Preaching Through podcast, and today we're going to be talking about Christmas and Easter, preaching a Christmas message, preaching an Easter message. Originally, we had Mother's Day in there because that's third biggest Sunday of the year. Kind of a different character altogether, but
maybe someday we can talk about that.
Maybe someday we can talk about
Christmas
that.
and Easter are big enough.
Yeah, there's enough lifting to do.
Yeah.
And on top of that, we were going to do 2 episodes on Christmas and Easter, but as we got to talking about it, they're really so similar.
Yeah.
There's so many of the same challenges, so many of the same opportunities. Some of the things that are consistent, I just wrote down a few right here, is family distractions. There's lots of family distractions with both. There is evangelism opportunity.
Yeah, hopefully.
And then there's also the fact that evangelism is overrated on Easter and Christmas.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that.
I think we'll probably have to, because I think a few people just don't turn it off just yet.
Yeah.
We'll get into it. We'll help you prepare a runway to make the most of that. So we're going to talk through just pretty much identify some of the differences, but that's really where we're going to end on separating them. We're just going to converge them together, and we're going to talk through what we as pastors need to do in order to prepare to preach an effective Easter or Christmas message.
Yeah, sounds great.
And you've been doing this for a while. How many Easter messages, Christmas messages have you taught?
Yeah, I think, I'd have to count exactly 13 or 14, somewhere in there. I mean, our church has been going, I think next January will be our 14th year. So somewhere in that neighborhood.
Before we do that, though, just want to remind you, this is the Preaching Through podcast, and every single episode, this is an invitation to pastors to come have a seat at the table and prepare to preach through different books, prepare to teach through different seasons of life, prepare to discuss issues that are central to following Jesus in this 21st century America. No matter how many times you practice it, it's a tongue twister for me. We don't want you in isolation. We know that you don't want to be in isolation either, but sometimes the realities of our staffing, sometimes the realities of our context means that we're going to spend a lot of time alone. And so our hope is that we can be one voice of encouragement, one voice of challenging you to grow and to increase the effectiveness of your ministry. Now, as we talk about Christmas and Easter today, it is kind of, I've heard you say that Easter is the Super Bowl of church, and I don't know, what would Christmas be like? The playoffs before the Super Bowl, I guess.
Yeah, it's like maybe the college national championship.
And maybe some of the bowl games, because Christmas, you got those weeks leading up to it.
Yeah, there's more of a parade kind of feel to the whole thing.
There is. And thinking about that, I recalled one of the big changes that we made in Easter a couple of years ago. So if this is the first time listening, Luke and I go to the same church. Luke's been the pastor here at Redemption Gateway, founded the church so many years ago. And a couple years ago, after COVID, I think it was 2021, we made the decision to move, you and the staff, I was not a part of it, made the decision to move the Easter service outside. And we are in Arizona, and it gets to be pretty hot around Easter time.
But that year Easter was early.
Yeah.
And we thought, we'll be fine. It was hot though.
It was hot.
It was record-breaking heat that day. I mean, it was close to 100 degrees.
I was grateful we showed up for the 7:30 service. But you had to be there for both.
Well, I was there for both. Yep. That's part of the deal. But yeah, it was, even the first service, it was starting to get hot.
Yeah.
And we did 2 outside, and it was like, oh man, the second service, this is going to be interesting. And it was wild. I mean, I'm up there preaching, and I'm just seeing like a wave of fans, people fanning themselves with different stuff, and their hats are off, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I have to end this sermon. I'm not going to finish this thing. And so it was interesting midstream to try to figure out, how am I going to stop this deal? Because everything, like, no one cares about what I'm saying right now. They just want this to end as quickly as possible. And so I had to figure out how to land the plane.
Nobody came out with the hook and pulled you off stage.
No. And interesting, nobody was like, man, I was so disappointed. It seemed like you really cut things off. They didn't care. They were happy. They were happy it was over.
Well, they probably had brunch plans that they needed to get to. We'll get into all of that. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you for listening. And let's start talking about preaching through Christmas and Easter.
A few years ago, a new pastor joined our team. He'd been on staff at another church for a number of years, had a lot of experience preaching. And before he preached for the first time at our church, I said, hey, after your sermon, we'll sit down and just debrief it and talk it through. And we did that. And I was able to give him some coaching feedback that just to me felt totally normal. But afterward, he said something that blew my mind. He said, I got more feedback from you after that one sermon than I've gotten all these other years that I've been involved in preaching. Now that stunned me. I grew up in an environment where you got lots of feedback, you got lots of coaching, but I realized that's actually not a common experience for most pastors. Most of us, we only get a little bit of a, hey, pastor, that was pretty good, or we get a nasty email, neither one of which are very helpful. And so I've created an experience where you can have the same kind of experience that he had, getting some tangible feedback as well as some really practical instruction on how to build and craft and deliver great sermons that are consistent week after week. I want to encourage you, I want to help you, and I want to come alongside any way I can. You don't need an overhaul, but a few small tweaks might go a long way to helping you be the preacher God made you to be, helping you find your voice, and helping you to serve the people God's called you to lead. So that's what the Preaching Lab Live is all about. To find out more, go to faithfulandfruitful.com/lab.
All right. So the place that I think is best to start, we already discussed a few of the similarities, but I really want to identify some of the differences because there are differences, unique differences, and that can change the way you approach your preparation for either of these two sermons. And when I talk about Christmas, there is the lead up to Christmas. I think in my mind, I typically mean Christmas Eve, because that's the one where you're having multiple services and everybody's showing up at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, depending on people's traditions, you might lead up to Christmas with Advent. You might lead up to Easter with Lent. Ministry Pass has great resources on both of those things, by the way, if people are interested in that. But yeah, we're mostly talking about Christmas Eve and Easter Sunday, I think.
Yeah, so a few of the differences I wrote down, I talked with my wife about this, and I think she had some pretty good things to say. Number one, Christmas is a season versus a Sunday. So there's lots of anticipation and built up culturally, not just within the church, but culturally. To me, it seems like there's a lot of different characters available that you could preach through a lens of for Christmas. Whereas Easter, it's kind of like, no, like it's Jesus and his resurrection. And that's the star every time. Christmas, I think, a little bit more festive overall than Easter tends to be. You will decorate the church for Christmas, whereas Easter, you will decorate the service.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Well, I'll take it. Probably right. Yeah. And then Christmas.
Well, I'm just thinking, I don't know what every church does. I mean, that's how we do it.
That's how we do it.
We tend to, the month before Christmas, we, redecorate the stage. It's kind of that way for a while, but different churches probably do that in different ways.
So, and then, Christmas Eve can be any day of the week. Easter's can be any Sunday of the spring, but it's always on a Sunday.
Yeah, that's an interesting one where, like you said, Christmas Eve, you're always figuring out what day of the week is it, but everyone always knows when it is. It's always December 24th. Whereas Easter, you always know it's a Sunday, but you don't know which Sunday. Is it in March? Is it in April? Nobody, I find every year Easter tends to sneak up on people more than Christmas does.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's in nature, it feels more like a holiday than it does a season.
Yeah, sure.
And like you said, there's different faith.
Yeah, there's Christmas songs.
Yeah.
There's a whole genre of it, right? The radio station, probably even before Thanksgiving starts, there's no like Easter radio station. I guess it's just Caleb.
So, so there's a lot of different differences that separate these two, but really there are a lot of key similarities. One of the things that makes both of these very similar is that there is one central story to tell. And I think that adds a lot of pressure to keep it fresh. I know do I preach the exact same message that I did last year and the year before that? Because it's the exact same story.
Yeah, I've had times where I've wanted to just to see if anyone would be able to tell the difference. And I think in those years, I think I've repeated one time, not the same sermon, but the same passage, good news of great joy for all the people. And by the way, that is an awesome sermon outline. Good news, great joy for all the people. Number one, good news. Number two, of great joy. Number three, for all the people. Right? I mean, it preaches itself. So I've come back to that a couple times. But yeah, I don't repeat the exact same thing. And yet I think the tendency is for us to just get way too cute about that. We remember more of what we preach than anybody. You go back through your notes, you find what you did. Nobody really remembers exactly. I mean, maybe if you have a really like knockout illustration and you use that same illustration every time, they'll start to go, hey, didn't you use that last year? But yeah, for the most part, we probably overthink it. I don't know if I've told you this, Dave, about this, but I actually was talking with a mentor once about how I don't like preaching on Christmas Eve. Have we talked about this?
We talked about it a little bit, but
Okay.
not on the Preaching Through podcast.
Yeah. So I just was saying to him, I was going, man, I wish I didn't have to do Christmas Eve. Like I'd love to just not have it. And actually in the beginning of our church, we met in a school and they wouldn't let us meet on Christmas Eve. So just the Sunday before Christmas was our Christmas service. And I kind of miss those days. And he said, well, here's why, Luke. He said, you are really, you have a teaching gift and you love to help people have an aha moment. And Christmas Eve is not designed for people to have an aha moment. And so it's always disappointing to you because they're so busy, they're so distracted, they're so focused on the dresses and the traditions and the cookies and what we're going to do after this. They're not looking for an aha moment. And sure enough, they don't have one. And so you are disappointed. He said, what you need to think about Christmas Eve as is more like a Young Life talk, where it's short, it's punchy, it's introducing people to Jesus, it's giving them something to think about, and it's over. And when that paradigm shifted for me, Christmas Eve actually became a lot more fun because it felt less about, oh, there's all this pressure, either for people to have an aha moment that leads to salvation or to have some big aha life-changing thing. Okay, we can dial that pressure down and introduce Jesus, celebrate the joy of what it means that he came, or in Easter's case, that he rose, and hopefully give people enough of a good experience and a good taste of what we're doing to say, I might want to come back to that.
So you mentioned like the aha moment. There are so many distractions. Everybody's wanting a photo.
Sure.
Everybody's got some sort of plans they're either coming from or going to. And I could see where if you're really wanting to make an impact, and we put so much pressure on ourselves for Easter, especially, but Easter and Christmas to be this huge evangelism opportunity, we put so much pressure that when people leave and we don't necessarily get that punch, the full impact of the punch, because there's all this buildup for both of them.
Yeah.
All hands on deck. We've set aside a line item in our budget for Easter and a line item for Christmas season. And when we don't feel like we get the return on that, it's this huge deflating feeling. And so does that, you and I were talking and setting up, and you said, I think the opportunity for evangelism is overrated. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, what I mean by that is the short-term, right this second fruit of evangelism seems limited. And it's different. If you're a gifted evangelist and that's your spiritual gift, and when you preach, a lot of people just come to faith, well, that's probably going to happen anytime you preach. So, but for those of us who aren't, we're doing the work of an evangelist, like Paul tells Timothy, but we're not evangelistically gifted. We're more preacher teachers. I want to say, I think Christmas Eve and Easter in the short run don't necessarily have a lot of evangelistic impact, but in the long run they do. So I just would want to change the time horizon and say, I want this sermon to contribute to maybe someone's first step of engaging with our church, but they're going to come back, and it's through engaging in the life of our church that actually is going to lead them to Christ, rather than feeling the pressure of I've got to win them now. So I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to win someone now. I mean, this is good news, and why wouldn't we give people an opportunity to respond? But I think we just set ourselves up for disappointment, and we sort of forget really what we're trying to do. Is I just want to give people enough of a real taste of what our church is like that might surprise them, make them go, oh, maybe there's more to that than I realized, and I want to try it again. And maybe they come back 2 months later. Maybe they come back, if I preach on Christmas Eve, maybe they come back on Easter. But I think to have a longer range perspective of it is just more realistic to actually how people come to faith.
So talking about that, I think it really dials into what is your connection strategy at the church? What's your assimilation strategy, and what's your discipleship strategy? And in our next episode, we're going to talk about preaching calendar and how that influences, or does it influence your discipleship strategy, or does the discipleship strategy influence the sermon calendar and, chicken and egg? Today we're going to talk. And so listen to that episode, because there will be a lot of ideas for follow-up and ideas for keeping people engaged. Today, we're going to dial into 3 ways to prepare for these biggest services of the year, whether it's Christmas, Easter. If you have a really large gathering at your church that's unique to your church, you do something in the fall, or maybe you really do make a big deal out of Mother's Day or a different holiday on the calendar. There's 3 ways to prepare for these big services. And the first way to prepare is ultimately to prepare yourself. Now, you gave me this quote. You said, this was from Martin Lloyd-Jones: "The sermon needs careful preparation, but altogether more important is the preparation of the preacher himself." You pulled that out. And why was that meaningful to you?
Well, that's meaningful to me all year long.
Yeah.
Not just in these holidays. But it's this reality that preaching is going to be the overflow of your life with Christ. And if you prepare sermons, but your heart's not deepening, and your affection for Christ isn't deepening, and your repentance isn't deepening, and all of that, then I think at some point the well that you're drawing from in your preaching, it just starts drying up. And so one of the main jobs of a preacher all year long is to prepare the preacher, which means it's getting counseling, and it's having friends, and it's having hobbies, and it's reading books that aren't necessarily related to whatever I'm preparing to preach. And it's digging a well. You can't rely on a flood. You have to dig a well to draw from. And I think that's especially crucial when you come to these holidays, because in these holiday seasons, everything is just more stressful.
Right.
And if you add all the stress on, I'm trying to draw from a pretty empty well, and the cup is clanging on the bottom, it's just going to compound all of the challenges of that already existing season.
One of the things that you've emphasized when you're preaching, especially on Easter, is that you really just want to get up there and have a posture of enjoying Jesus in front of all of these people. Talking about, and hearkening back to the moments that you've had, the first moments that you knew the Lord and what that meant. How do you enjoy Jesus? I mean, you pull from that well, but like, am I supposed to go up there and just be smiles the whole time?
No, probably not. At the same time, I don't know that Christmas and Easter is like, all right, everyone open up to Lamentations. These are holidays. They're moments to celebrate. There should be a posture of rejoicing. And I think there is a place in the church for lament and for grieving. It's why a season like Lent is really valuable. But Christmas and Easter is not the time. Right. And I know that the temptation we can actually get a little cynical by how happy clappy everything gets around holiday time.
Yeah.
We go, well, I'm going to bring some reality to this. And it's like, well, that's not going to be a very fun experience for anybody, probably not the time. So, and at the same time, when I mean enjoying Jesus in front of people, I also don't mean pasting on some kind of phony baloney happiness, right? This is not, this isn't fake. This is real. I have a real thing with God. Part of what I think about as I prepare these kind of sermons and evangelistic oriented sermons, which even though I'm telling you, I think the evangelistic horizon is longer. Part of what I want to do in these holiday sermons is to make people who don't believe wish it were true. Where they say, I don't know if I agree with that, but man, I wish it was true. And I think one of the things that contributes to that is the preacher seeming like he's glad that it's true.
Right.
And so that feels important. Like I'm fine if people go, I don't believe it, but I think he does. Then that's a win to me.
So you've got the idea of getting up on stage and enjoying Jesus in front of everyone. That's the posture to get ready for that. Just a few of the things that are easy to overlook, but really important. I mean, obviously prayer.
Sure.
Obviously prayer. We say that.
Yeah.
But truthfully, prayer. In our small group this last week, I found myself saying something that I've never said before, but we were talking about just, charismatic and spirit-filled and just that idea, and it was a really great conversation. And I found myself saying my childhood was marked by answered prayer. And I experienced my childhood clearly.
Yeah.
But I had never realized that really was the mark of God growing up.
What a blessing.
Yeah.
How many people can say that?
Yeah.
That's way cool.
It was very cool. So yes, obviously prayer, but truthfully, really prayer. Walking, getting out, if that's helpful for you, getting out and walking and getting fresh air and not being influenced necessarily by all of these different inputs. Sleeping is a huge one.
Yeah. Yeah. I find for me I can actually tell Easter's coming because my sleep gets more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Exercise. Exercise will rejuvenate you. Sometimes always getting in shape is harder than staying in shape, but exercise of some way, shape, or form. You already mentioned it. Reading. And one of the things that I know that you and your family have done in the past, I know COVID kind of changed all of our behaviors, but getting together and going to the park on Good Friday and just using that as a time of preparation.
Yeah, we have a tradition because I realized, man, this Easter, and at our church, we also do Good Friday. So we do a Good Friday service, and then we come back and do an Easter service. So it's a very intense weekend, and there's a lot of meeting new people, and there's a lot of emotional energy. And one of the things that I realized is I don't want my kids to grow up with only the experience of me as a public figure
right
on these holidays. And so, we developed this tradition. There's this park kind of near us where there's a little garden, and the folks that designed it actually, most people know this, but it's designed in the shape of a cross. If you were to have an overhead view of it, it's that way. And so we go there on Good Friday and we read a little story from the Bible and we pray and we just thank the Lord together. And it's my favorite part actually of that whole weekend. And mostly that's just me saying, I want to be a Christian before I'm a pastor. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to have being a preacher and a pastor get in the way of just being a Christian and just enjoying the Lord for myself and for my family. So that's what we do.
So you've ultimately doing all of this because, as you've put it, the enemy will turn up the heat during these big high stakes. Everybody is aware, if not hyper aware, of at least Jesus as a person.
Uh-huh.
And there's so much opportunity to make a case for Jesus as Lord and Jesus as Savior. And as Jesus as resurrected King, the enemy is looking at that and he's setting his sights and he wants to neutralize you. And so all of these things help prepare you to have a fresh energy, a fresh perspective, and just a renewed sense of who God is and what he has done in your life and how Jesus has made a difference. You get up there and you enjoy Jesus in front of everyone. The second way to prepare is to actually prepare the recovery. And there's this huge drop off. I mean, how would you, I've never taught on Easter Sunday. I've been a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
How would you explain that transition from Sunday or Christmas Eve to the following week?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where you start to go, oh, I guess hundreds of people didn't get saved last week because they're not here. It's the next week. And I do think as a general rule, it's especially if you're in an environment where you're not the only preacher, but maybe you're the primary preacher. I think it's good for the primary preacher or the lead pastor to be preaching that second Sunday after, or that Sunday after, after Easter, because if someone comes back, I don't want them to have a radically different experience.
Right.
And yet, yeah, it's a different thing. And it's kind of, okay, back to normal. And we can lament that, I guess, but it's like, it just is the way it is. So it's more like, how do you accept it? But it's even to me less about that Sunday and more about the weeks that follow and through the week. And so, yeah, it's really, a lot of what I try to do is have the week after Easter, just be a little slower in my calendar, a few less meetings booked, a little more time to go on a walk or to, take a nap or whatever the case might be. And then oftentimes 2 or 3 weeks after Easter, I'll try to have a time with my wife where we get alone for a couple of days, or we go on a little mini getaway of some kind just to try to recalibrate.
As much as your congregation, as much as the visitors and the guests need you to show up and preach big on Easter, Christmas, these other big services, your family needs you available for the long haul, and your church needs you for a long-term ministry impact, not just some sort of a short-term ministry infusion. So that recovery is, I'm grateful for the leaders in my life when they do that sort of thing, because I do count on them. But if they're not being good to themselves, they're going to get used up, dried up, good for nothing and good for no one.
Yeah. And what I'd say on this is you have to have a plan for it in
Yeah.
advance.
Yeah.
You will not likely spontaneously create space for rest. You have to have a plan. And actually putting it on the calendar, committing to it, getting other people to help fill in gaps is part of what's required to actually be able to pull it off.
So we're talking about all of these things leading up to actually preaching the message, but as much as it's important to prepare the preacher, to prepare the people, or to prepare the recovery, it's important to prepare the people and prepare the service before you get to the actual preparation of the sermon. All of this builds up, because if you just show up on Sunday morning with no plan, no purpose, I think you've likened it to running a marathon. Like if you don't have all of the steps going up, what was it? You said Molly ran a marathon and she felt great, but her friend couldn't walk normal for weeks.
Right. Yeah, sure.
So you've got to do all of this stuff if you want that sermon to have the intended impact, or at least set it up and say, hey, God, open-handed here. I'm going to give this over. I've done all the work. I'm going to let you move. You prepare the people. And so we talked a little bit about just the logistics, making sure that they know when it is, making sure that they know when the services are. This is all pretty normal, but encouraging people to invite their friends.
Yeah.
Now, we think about that and we're like, well, yeah, of course. But truthfully, there is something that people who are in your congregation want to know before they're going to go out there and kind of become vulnerable and invite somebody to church. And that is, can I trust the message that will be preached?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I trust the message, and can I trust the overall experience? Like there was one year that we did a real, kind of crazy opener thing with a bunch of lights and guitars and whatever.
Big dog and pony show.
Yeah, big dog and pony show, which was really fun, but it also was really different from the kind of thing we normally do. And we actually had a couple in the church who asked me about it later and said, hey, we invited these folks and we just started getting really nervous because it felt inconsistent with what we normally do. And we don't want, we want to give people a taste of what it's really like. And so that's why actually from that I learned, okay, of course it is a bigger deal and it is a little different, right? In our case right now, we're doing Easter outside. That's a different kind of thing, but it should be enough similar to what a normal experience is like, so that when the person comes back, they don't go, oh wait, I thought I was eating at a Mexican restaurant and then I came back and it was a Thai restaurant. What happened? You don't want to, it needs to be enough of a consistent experience, even though, of course, the photo booth's out and the Christmas trees are up. And
you got donkeys in the lobby.
Yeah, right. You got all that stuff. But enough that it's like, okay, I recognize this place. And that's why really the consistency of your experience leading up to and always really dictates whether people will buy in when you say, hey, you should invite someone to this. I actually want to have a church where people can invite people every week, and not feel like, am I going to get embarrassed here? There's just this reality in a word of mouth thing. If you love an experience, but you aren't really loving the process of that experience, you will keep doing the experience. You just won't invite people to do it. And it's the same thing with church.
So really what we want to do is aim for a really good version of who we normally are.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
Well, you originally said it that way. So
great.
There you go. It's one of those things like people will come up to you and
as
say,
I always say.
Yeah, when you said this in the sermon.
Right.
And you're like, I don't think I said that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure I never said that.
So a really great version of who you normally are, and simple quality trumps complex mediocrity. So really just, you said that too.
Okay.
I went back through some of your old videos. See,
Well,
I'm doing my homework
Yeah,
here.
it's just there's this tendency we try to get too cute.
Yeah.
You know, we just need to not be so cute, like, okay, it's Christmas. You could go to Isaiah and talk about these amazing prophecies about Jesus. How about you just read the Christmas story and talk about Jesus came to save his people from their sins? Like, just don't get too cute with it.
Yeah. So as somebody who attends church, I'm not on staff, I'm not in vocational ministry. All I want is to just tap in to, during Christmas, all I want is to tap into what I remember from years before. And I want that experience for my kids. And so I'm not complaining here, but when the Christmas songs change, I don't really like that, because I really enjoy the renditions and the pacings.
You mean like when people do new versions of traditional Christmas songs?
Yeah, if it's the same
Yeah.
key signature, the same time frame, but it's just a different, instrumentation, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But I really just want something that I can show. I go to the church and I just want to show up and have an experience that is consistent with what I know Christmas to
You and
have
Clark
been.
Griswold, you just want a good old-fashioned
I just
family
want a good
Christmas.
old-fashioned family Christmas for my kids, and then pass it on to the generation. So I like that idea of like, just preach Christmas, just preach the birth story.
Yeah.
Because that's what people are there to hear.
Well, and the reality is, it's amazing.
Yeah. It's not like you're trying to just rub two sticks together here.
How do I build up some energy around that God became a person to save the world? I don't know.
Yeah.
And that is where you go, oh yeah, this is profound.
So you've got to prepare yourself, prepare the recovery, the people, service, and now we're getting to the place where we actually prepare the sermon. And you really want to start sooner than you think. You don't want to leave this thing to the last minute. And certainly, like I said, like, you don't want to get up there and just wing it. It's a privilege to preach. And
yeah, I talked to a friend of mine who had, retired, had handed off his leadership.
Yeah.
And he said, man, I didn't love preaching those holidays, but now that I can't do it anymore, I sure miss it.
Yeah.
And I remind myself of that, because sometimes I do feel like that. And I go, there's going to be a time when I don't preach the Easter message or the Christmas message. And so I'm going to enjoy it while I can.
Well, it's in those moments of ministry for me, whether it's on the platform or whether it's in one-on-one relationships, it's really incredible to see how God will make much out of whatever loaves and fish you bring to the table. And in 1 Corinthians 1:21, it pleases God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. And so,
yeah, God uses our preaching. How
Yeah.
nuts is that?
Mhm.
I mean, if you were God, do you think you'd set it up that way? Like, hey, let these knuckleheads explain it, and that'll be my plan A. Oh, also, I don't have a plan B. Like, that's crazy. And
Yeah.
yet that's what God does.
and I already mentioned it, but like, that God is working, because you do hear people come up and explain back to you something that you said. Maybe you did say it or maybe you didn't, but God was working in their hearts and their
Yeah.
minds.
Well, and that is why, despite me saying, hey, a lot of times people don't get saved on these days, sometimes they do.
Yeah.
Right? Because this isn't just a manufactured social environment. This is a spiritual environment.
Mm-hmm.
And we pray and we ask and we seek and we hope that God will answer. And sometimes he answers right away. And sometimes he plants the seeds that get watered and harvested later.
As much as it's the benefit to preach, it's a huge privilege. There's also a burden to it as well. You've said in the past, it's like an oral exam. How did it go?
Well, that's just preaching. I mean, every week preaching is like you have an oral exam and people are bringing friends to watch it. So, I like when people are like, "Oh, you only work one day a week." It's like, well, imagine. I mean, A, that's not true, but B, imagine when you have to give your big presentation at work, the thing that you prepare for weeks and weeks and weeks. Imagine you have to do that every week, but now there's new people coming to watch it. Like, do you think that would be pressure? And they go, I don't actually ever say that to them.
I'm sorry I ever came up
That's
here.
just the conversation in my head,
So, I mean, there is that burden. I would imagine there's a pressure to come, like when you're like,
and
me.
You know what though, Dave? That's
Yeah.
my favorite thing. Like my favorite thing on those holidays
is
when someone from our church will come up with a twinkle in their eye and they'll go, she's here.
Yeah.
He's here. My uncle. Oh, my daughter, my whoever, they're here. They came. They said yes. And there is something about going, okay, that's who I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
I'm now talking to that person's parents. I'm now talking to that person's sister. And that really focuses you as a preacher and is really great. I love that stuff.
So, as much as you can prepare message week in and week out, when you preach occasionally, like I did, like you've got your best stuff, so to speak, that you don't really have to come up with new stuff. But I do know that there is a pressure to come up with new things, so that burden of preaching on Christmas and Easter is like, how am I going to talk about this different? What's the lens that I'm going to go through this year? I think that comes back to why you want to start a lot sooner than you think you need to. I've already mentioned it several times. We're going to talk about preaching calendar in our next episode, and that can really have, if you plan out ahead your entire series, that can really have an impact on how you approach what you're going to talk about during Christmas, whether it's a carryover of a series or following up a series. So really, ultimately, though, you want to have this fresh, new communication to allow people to have an experience of something that's true all of the time. Jesus, his story, it's always true. But on Christmas and Easter, there is that burden to. We were listening to a podcast, and the phrase that the person being interviewed says, like, enchantment. And I don't know that necessarily you or I would describe it that way, but just the active environment or an environment where the Spirit is active. There's kind of this enchantment of Christianity, and there is pressure to deliver that on Christmas or Easter.
Yeah, there is pressure on it. And yet I think a better way to think about it is to try to be more like Apple. I don't have anything to compare it to, but I think about Apple, like you'd go, it is shockingly simple, and yet it's beautiful. And I think sometimes we just try to really gussy it up. We got to be, I got to be fresh. I got to be, and it's like, no, it is significant. Figure out a fresh take, but make it simple. And that becomes important, especially one of the dynamics, at least in our environment, and everyone's situation is a little different, but on Christmas Eve and Easter in our environment, we usually have children in the room. So that's another distinct thing where, I mean, there's always some kids on a Sunday, but there's a lot of kids that are 5, 6, 7 years old in the room. And part of what I'm thinking is, how do I engage them? And how do I engage them early in the sermon? Because if they get squirrely, everyone else is checking out because they're trying to pay attention to them. And so that means early on in one of these sermons, I'm almost always going to have some sort of interesting story or over the top picture of something. Or, some years ago I did like a quiz, how well do you know the Christmas story really? And those sorts of things that feel a little, they feel slightly corny to me, and maybe they are, but for that 7-year-old sitting there, it really helps him lock in for another 10 minutes.
Yeah.
and
mom and dad are very appreciative.
Yeah, totally. And so I think it's like, okay, there's some freshness there, but then in the end, go to the simplicity and the core of what this is. You believe that this is amazing, that God became a human being. Talk about that. You believe that this is the best news in the world, that Jesus rose from the dead and conquered Satan, sin, and death. Talk about that.
Yeah.
Don't get too cute. Don't get too clever. Figure out what's a good illustration, what's a good word picture, what's a good application and insight, and land the plane.
All right. So you've done all the preparation, you've done all the planning, and now the actual sermon comes around. There's 4 decisions you need to make, and there's 4 dangers to avoid. The first decision that you need to make is to decide on a target. How do you decide on your target? Who are you talking to?
Yeah, I mean, generally you should have a sense of who you're talking to anyway. And I think this depends on your context. It depends where you are and who your people are. I think for me, I'm aiming at what Larry Osborne calls the hell of a talk guy. The guy who's going to afterward maybe go, that was a hell of a talk. I want to aim at that person. And make that person go, oh, I'm glad I came. That was a hell of a talk, And so that's probably what I'm aiming at. I don't even think everyone has to aim at that. I would just say aim at something. Aim at a 17-year-old non-Christian, or aim at a, middle-aged woman going through a midlife crisis. I mean, whatever, but pick a target and really try to hit it.
I know for a season, I don't know if this is still the case, but I know for a season with the staff and the preaching team, it was to surprise people with the significance of Jesus. That was the goal for the Sunday service, if I remember.
that's still what we
correctly.
talk about.
That's
Sure.
still what we talk about. So it's not just having somebody be surprised. Wow, I never thought about that. But it's being surprised by the significance of Jesus, and to have them, like an illustration is like, Jesus is more amazing
Yeah.
than I ever knew. And so that's kind of a big target to aim for, and say, I want my message to surprise people with the significance of Jesus, true for here at Redemption. But then to kind of niche down from there, using your context, your community. The second is to decide a lane. And I think this is really a great way to keep it fresh from year to year, is if you pick a different lane each year and you kind of rotate them, it allows you to preach from a different angle just naturally. So you've got the narrative lane, apologetic approach, and then the theme approach. How do you choose which direction you're going to go? And what insights could you give me if I was having to pick my lane?
Yeah, you could do any of those 3 lanes for both Christmas or Easter.
Yeah.
I think in particular, that works really well with Easter, right? You're going, am I preaching a narrative of the Easter story where I'm just explaining, here's what happened and here's where we go? Is it more of an apologetic sermon about the resurrection, or about, some other, big existential question that somebody has?
Yeah.
Or is it a theme of how, the resurrection gives us new life, or the resurrection gives us forgiveness, or the resurrection gives us reconciliation with God, or that sort of a thing? And I don't know, man. I think you just kind of pray about it, and you bounce it off a couple of your leaders, and you think about what you've been doing as a church lately. For example, this past Easter, we were going through the Gospel of John. There was a lot of narrative around John. And so I went, okay, I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 15 and talk about the hope that we have because of the resurrection, because that just is a little bit different than where we've been camping. And so I don't know. I don't think there's one right way. It's just have some gut feel about it and pick a lane.
How do you decide the length then
of the sermon?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that depends a lot on your situation, right? So we've had times where we're doing two services, and they're about the length of a normal service. And so your sermon can be about the same length, right? And then other times it's like we're doing 4 or 5 services, and they're all jammed together, and they've all got to be an hour, and there's a bunch of kids in the room. And okay, this one's going to be 15 or 18 minutes. I will say one of the things I do, if it is going to be shorter, I usually do a run through just to try to make sure I'm going to hit that time. But yeah, you just figure that out with your team. I don't think, one of the things I don't know if I've said it on here, but sermons are not measured in minutes. They're measured in minutes beyond people's interests.
Yeah.
And so, if you have 18 minutes of interesting things to say, then don't preach a 30-minute sermon, preach an 18-minute sermon. So, but yeah, it usually depends on how much music and how much whatever else.
Yeah. And then response. So we kind of have this big expectation of what the response is going to be, but maybe going in, deciding on the response that we want people to have can kind of temper those expectations, make it a little bit more realistic, and then give you something specific to aim for. So,
well, yeah, you're the marketing guy. I mean, good marketing always has what?
A call to action.
A call to action.
Call to action. And I would say the clearer and the more limited the call to action is, the better the response is going to be.
Right. If you give, here's your 6 ways to respond.
Yeah.
Not going to work.
Not interested. Yeah. The easiest way to articulate it is, in the presence of many choices, no choice is the easiest one to make. And so
wow, that's good.
You just say, well, I'm going to abstain. And then you can do things to position a response. If you're trying to gear people to go to a specific thing, you can position, a really low stakes offer on the outside and a really high stakes offer on the other side, and try to move people towards the direction that you want. But for me personally, with my ministry brain turned on, I feel like if I have a specific series that I'm getting lined up to do that talks about a specific theme that is really great on the heels of Christmas or Easter, really put my eggs in that basket. And the goal is just get somebody to show up the next week.
Yeah.
Like that's where I would put my eggs, at least in my limited knowledge of leading a church, right? Put my eggs in the basket of all I'm going to ask people to do is show up next week.
Yeah. Well, I think it was in Acts 17 where Paul's preaching at the Areopagus, and it says some people thought he was ridiculous. Some people said, we want in. And some people said, we want to hear more.
Yeah.
And I'd say at least give people an opportunity to come in. Hey, here's how you believe in Christ. And I don't know that could be an altar call. It doesn't have to be, but inviting people to follow Jesus or inviting them to keep coming back. And you're right. Having something worth coming back to that you can invite them to is great. One of the things we do as a church, the Sunday after Christmas every year, we do a thing called Ask Anything, where people text in questions and me and a couple of our senior leaders just answer them on the fly. Well, talking about that on a Christmas Eve it gets that kind of, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Whoa, wait, these people at this church just answer questions that people have. Like, that's kind of interesting. I might come to that. Now, whether they come or not, it's a different thing, but have something worth inviting them back to.
And then once you've made these decisions, really it comes back to the pastor personally to avoid some dangers. And one thing that's been littered throughout this whole thing as a church is our whole discussion is don't be a church that you're not. Don't try to pull off some sort of extravagant programming that isn't consistent with you. And that's really true for the pastor as well. Like, a danger to avoid is trying to be a different version of yourself.
Yeah, like one little thing is I had this buddy in ministry who 51 Sundays a year, he'd be up there with his Bible. And on Christmas Eve, he'd be up there with a notebook. And I was like, that's so stupid. I just told him, why would you do that? Like, and the reason he did it is he actually also had a pulpit and he had notes out and he didn't want to have all that.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to feel more like a fireside chat. And I said, yeah, well, it feels like you're talking out of your own thoughts out of a notebook. And you don't believe that. You believe you should talk out of the Bible. Hold a Bible. And so it can be as little as that. But yeah, be consistent with who you are.
I know that pressure. When I did music early on, I felt the pressure to be like the musicians that I saw doing worship music or doing concerts or doing whatever. Because I didn't know my own identity.
Sure.
I didn't know what it meant for me to be a musician, for me to be a guitar player, for me to be a lead singer. And so it was very easy for me to pull from all of the different personalities that I looked at and perceived as they seem to have figured it out. Like, that works for them. I'll make it work for me. And the older I get, the more I realize, man, there's nobody else in the world quite like me.
Yeah.
And God can use me just the way that I am. And I get more comfortable in my own skin. I would imagine for your preaching that's similar. There's a similar feeling to that.
Yeah. Well, when you're new, I mean, Tim Keller says that when you're new as a preacher, no matter what, your first 200 sermons stink. Mm-hmm. And so when you're figuring out, you go, well, I don't really know who I am. Yeah, but you know who the church is. You know the kinds of services you've been doing for the last 3 months. Just make sure that this next one's not a radical departure from that. It might be a chance to go, hey, we're going to try a choir, if we don't normally have a choir, or we're going to try using a video element, or we're going to try, so I'm not saying you can't do something more interesting or creative, but if the people in your church just have whiplash because they go, whoa, I don't even recognize this place. And then the next week it's going to go back to the way it always was. Well, I just think you're not doing yourself a lot of favors, actually. The creative people like that, but then you go back to boring the next week. So I just say be a good version of yourself.
Another danger to avoid is practicing on the people. This is a big one for me. I never thought about this. I just naturally, when I had to give a talk, a message or a speech or whatever the case might be, I would go up in my office and I would probably preach that message, 15 times. And I'd get 5 minutes in and I'd find myself using words that I didn't want to use. And so I'd go back and I'd change my manuscript. And then I'd get 7 minutes in, same thing. And then I'd start it over. And by the time I got to the end, I had chosen all the words that I wanted to use. So I wasn't repeating myself. And so things were more organized. So for me, it just made sense because I didn't want to look like a fool.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be stumbling.
Sure.
But there's the other element of maybe you're not scared about looking about a fool, but you're actually not doing the message the due diligence that it deserves if you're just going up there and the first person to hear your message are the people there on Sunday morning.
Yeah. Well, I remember one time, seeing some ad online or whatever. It was like, double the effectiveness of your preaching. And so I put in my email address and I got the resource and I got the ebook back. And the ebook basically was like, practice your sermon in advance. Like, oh, And I went, you know what? That's actually true. Because if you're in an environment where you preach multiple times after the first service, if you're not a dummy, you go to a couple people close to you and go, hey, what do you got for me? What could be better? Or you just know in your head, like, I got to tweak that a little shorter there, a little longer there. Well, if you inevitably do that after your first service, why wouldn't you make your first service one where there aren't people there, and do it in an open room, do it up in an office? I actually like to go do it on the stage and get a feel for it. It feels weird. I've had times where, somebody comes in the room because they're cleaning the building and it's like, don't mind me up here talking to myself. Yeah. So it's awkward. It's strange. It's kind of like watching yourself on video.
Yeah.
And yet it's like, well, do you want to be awkward or do you want everyone else to be awkward when your sermon's lame? So it's like, well, if you put it that way, okay, I guess I should practice.
When I was practicing in my office, I mean, it's my wife. She's out there. It's my wife. She loves me. I really couldn't do I probably do far dumber things than talk to myself in the office. And she loves me. But I wanted to close that door.
Oh, yeah.
And when I was wanting to get animated and I was like, okay, this is the part that I want to get excited about, I'd be like, get excited about this part. But I wouldn't I would feel like I had to temper it down because I don't want to hear me up
Sure.
in the office and whatnot. So yeah, it does feel a little bit weird, but I'll tell you what, that next Sunday in my limited experience on the platform, that Sunday, I said what I wanted to say. I said what needed to be said. And I felt like I did the word justice.
Yeah.
So that confidence, there's really no replacement for that. Making it about you. It's very easy to do that. I went to go do my first wedding and I was really, really anxious about it. And the pastor sat me down. He goes, nobody is there to see you. Nobody cares about you. And it was this huge weight lifted off. But unless he had said that, I was going to make it about me. Don't make it about you on Christmas and Easter. I mean, is that a valid?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a temptation for pastors all the time.
Yeah.
Is every week. But especially on those big days when everybody's there and they invited friends and you got all that pressure. And it's like, okay, like, of course, you'd want to. And there's nothing wrong with afterwards someone saying, hey, that was great. Thanks. But, man, if you live by that sword, you'll die by that sword, and if you got to have all the attaboys, then you'll be crushed when you don't. And so it's just, that's a hall of mirrors that if you live in it, it won't be long before it crushes you.
The way I look at it, and has been very helpful for me, investing in an outcome I may never get to see.
Yeah.
Hey, that's the parable, right? Sowing the seeds, someone else is going to, sowing the seeds, someone else will come around and reap the harvest. God's in control of it all. I'll just invest in the outcome and just trust that God's going to do his work. And
yeah, but where this comes up is especially when you're insecure and it's like, well, now I got to really be funny, or now I got to really be clever, or now I really want to, razzle dazzle them with whatever. And, it's one thing to go, I'm going to try to be clever because I really want to connect with these people who are far from Christ. It's another thing to go, I really want to be clever because, man, I want them to like me.
Mm-hmm.
It's subtle, but it's that little poison's in our heart and we've got to fight it.
As much as that is preparing with your head, kind of overthinking it, and I want people to like me, as much as that is preparing with your head and not your heart, there's also the other side of it, where you're really focusing on the intellectual reasons for Christmas and for the birth story or for Easter and the resurrection story. And you're not focusing on your heart. And I think that's the last danger to avoid, is really preparing with your head, but not accessing your heart. What are some ways that when you want to access your heart and really preach from the heart, what are some ways that you kind of jog yourself into that position?
Yeah, for me, a lot of times it's music.
Mm-hmm.
So God uses music to reawaken my heart. Sometimes it's going back and listening to a sermon by somebody that really moved me, or reading a chapter of a book that at some point really moved me. It's part of what we were talking earlier of like, this is just reminding yourself of what you already believe and what you already think is true, but having to get yourself in a heart space to feel it.
One of the things that I've heard said of, getting up there and preach, show people that you are a customer. You're not just the salesman, but you're a customer. You use the product that you are telling everybody about. And I thought that was a really great way of articulating, you're not outside of this. You're very much a part of this. And Jesus has made just a big impact on your heart as you believe that he can have in the hearts of everybody who's hearing that message. And they're not going to remember all of the things that you say, but they're going to remember the things that you get excited about and the things that you emphasize.
Yep.
And so in your preparation to preach that message, make an intentional decision. Here's where I'm going to get excited. This is the point that I'm going to emphasize. This is the one thing that I want somebody to walk away with. If it does come back to that discussion of, I don't know if I believe that, but that guy believes what he's talking about.
Well, maybe one of the underutilized tools in these kinds of sermons is actually our own personal testimony. I know there's some preachers that every sermon they preach, they share their testimony. But this is a great time to say, here's what God has done in my life. Here's how he changed me. And not just here's how he did it 25 years ago, but here's how he did it last week, and here's how he did it a couple months ago. And letting people into those stories, you have to be careful. Am I doing this to manipulate them, or am I, false, fake vulnerability is creepy. But telling people your story of how God's changed your life, this is a great moment to do it. Also, you're looking for engaging stories, things that might stick with people. You hear a story of someone coming to Christ, you almost always remember how it happened. And so I think that's a tool that maybe we forget we are allowed to use on some of these big days.
So the way I was originally going to end the conversation is to say, what if you do not enjoy preaching on Easter or do not enjoy preaching on Christmas Eve? You just want to preach a normal Sunday. And you already talked about that. You said, well, I didn't enjoy preaching Christmas Eve. And then I realized that I don't have to make some sort of an aha moment happen. I do know that it's going to be a reality for a lot of the pastors, that it is going to be tough. And as much as listening to podcasts like this can help and having discussions, it's not going to be as simple as an aha moment like you had. I don't need somebody to have an aha moment.
Right.
What type of encouragement do you have to offer myself and other preachers out there? Hey, this really is tough for me to get up for.
Yeah. What I would say is reframe it in the context of your whole ministry and realize it's a piece of the ministry. It's not the whole ministry. It's not the biggest piece of the ministry. But it's a piece, and it's a meaningful piece, but it's just a piece. Right. And of course it's the thing where you and all your pastor buddies are going to text each other before, hey, I'm praying for you. And afterward, hey, how'd it go? And, and you feel all of that stuff. And, and then you have all the pressure of the staff and the everything else. And so you can't help but feel some of that, but step back and go, okay, let me think about the other ministry I do, the leaders I develop, and the people I visit in the hospital, and the emails that I write, and the sermons that I prepare on a normal thing, and the counsel, and go, okay, you know what? This part's not my favorite. Okay. I'm going to do my best. And I'm going to remember that actually this is just one piece of an overall ministry that I'm trying to have be healthy. And maybe that can just help lower the anxiety and the pressure of it a little bit.
So talking about preaching through Christmas, talking about preaching through Easter, obviously there's a lot more that could be discussed and there's a lot more that could be covered. But my hope is that this would give a start to the conversation. At the time of this recording, we are quite a few months out from Christmas, and we are certainly a lot of time out ahead of Easter. So that means that right now we are starting the conversation for you. You can take this and set aside some time to think about with your core leaders. Bring other people into the mix. If you are pastoring solo and maybe you have a part-timer or even just volunteer people on staff, bring in a few trusted elders, a few trusted deacons. You've got people in your congregation who have sat and listened to thousands of sermons, and they love Jesus and they want nothing but the best for you, and they want to see the ministry prosper. Bring those people into the fold and start discussing, hey, in the past, this is the way we've approached Christmas. I want to think about doing it a little bit different. If we were to make some changes this year, I'm not saying we are, but if we were, what could those changes be? Or what's some ways that we could improve? Or if we're looking at Easter, what are some things that we could do to help it be the celebration that it truly is? And the more input and the more voices of people who love God and really want to see you as the pastor thrive and the ministry prosper and just see the kingdom come here on earth, the more input you can have from those folks, the more exciting it'll be to see those things to come to fruition. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. Wherever you are listening, please be sure to subscribe and rate or review. If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review. We really appreciate that. We've got 1 review so far.
Awesome.
We'd love to have 2.
Yeah.
Y'all make that a second review. So you can leave a rating. You can review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We've got more episodes coming up. Like I said, next week is going to be preaching through a sermon calendar. This is one that I've spent a lot of time researching and putting together a large paper on that. And when I showed it to you, you go, do you remember what you said?
I don't. I don't remember.
You looked at me and you go, and I was real proud of it. And I was like, hey, here's this thing I made. And you were gracious, but you go, yeah, I mean, I looked at it. It was good. Like, I just don't understand why you wouldn't use a preaching calendar. Well, there's a lot of reasons why people may not use a preaching calendar. And my hope is that in the next episode, we will destroy all of your reasons for not using a preaching calendar. And you'll walk out saying like, I don't know if I believe in a preaching calendar, but that guy sure does. Thanks for listening. Take care.